The countryside lay silent beneath the glow of the moon, every blade of grass shining silver in the soft night. The air was crisp, and the rustling of leaves seemed louder than usual, echoing across the open fields. From somewhere deep in the forest, the howl of a coyote carried on the wind, sharp and eerie, a reminder that this peaceful land was still ruled by the wild. The farmhouse at the edge of the meadow stood like a lonely sentinel. Its wooden frame had weathered decades of storms, yet tonight it felt fragile, almost insignificant against the vast stretch of wilderness beyond. Animals in the barn shifted uneasily, their instincts picking up what human eyes and ears could not. The night was too still, too perfect. Something was about to change. Near the barn, a scruffy golden puppy named Bailey stumbled through the grass, his small paws damp with dew. He chased after fireflies, snapping playfully at their flickering light. His short tail wagged furiously every time a tiny glowing insect escaped his grasp, as though each failure was still a victory. He was young, innocent, and blissfully unaware of danger. The forest edge loomed not far from where Bailey played. The trees stood dark and tall, like watchmen keeping secrets in their shadows. From those shadows, unseen eyes were already watching. Hungry eyes. Patient eyes. The moon shone brighter, illuminating Bailey's small frame. Against the vastness of the night, he looked impossibly fragile. Yet in his tiny heart was a spark of life, a hope that had carried him to the Sanders porch a week ago. That spark would be tested tonight in ways he could not imagine. Bailey had spent his first week at the Sanders farm exploring timidly. At first, he barely dared to leave the porch, trembling at the slightest sound. But as the days passed, warmth and kindness had given him courage. Mrs. Sanders' gentle hands, the warmth of the barn, and the scent of hay had begun to make him feel safe. Tonight, his curiosity drew him further than usual. The cool grass tickled his paws as he bounded in short bursts of energy. He paused every now and then, ears perked, before scurrying back a step. Then, emboldened by the soft glow of fireflies, he chased them toward the darker end of the yard. The world seemed magical to Bailey. The fireflies danced like stars fallen from the sky, drifting slowly through the night. He barked softly, his puppy voice high-pitched and playful. Each flash of light pulled him closer to the forest, away from the farmhouse where safety waited. Inside the farmhouse, Mr. Sanders sipped his tea. He chuckled at the faint yips outside, shaking his head. "That pup," he murmured, "already thinks the world is his playground." His wife smiled, pouring more tea into his cup. Neither of them thought the night held anything more than the charm of country quiet. But Bailey's play had a price. Each step closer to the tree-line brought him into the unseen circle of predators. The fireflies led him on, innocent and unaware. The coyotes were waiting. The first growl was low and guttural, so quiet that even the wind seemed to hush in fear. Bailey froze, his ears twitching toward the sound. His tail stopped wagging, dropping low between his legs. The glow of fireflies faded into the shadows as the forest revealed what it had been hiding. From the undergrowth, pairs of glowing eyes appeared one by one. Greenish, eerie, and unblinking, the coyotes moved like whispers, lean bodies gliding silently over the grass, their muscles taut with hunger. The alpha, larger than the rest, stepped forward with a deliberate grace. His sharp teeth flashed briefly in the moonlight. Bailey whimpered, shrinking back, but his paws seemed glued to the ground. His heart raced, but his legs refused to move. Instinct screamed at him to run, yet fear bound him like chains. The coyotes fanned out, circling him with the precision of hunters that had done this countless times before. From inside the farmhouse, the Sanders were oblivious. Mr. Sanders tapped his cup thoughtfully, staring at the firelight. His wife hummed softly as she cleared the table. The night outside remained calm to their ears, but beneath the surface, danger was brewing. Bailey lowered himself onto the grass, trembling violently. The growls grew louder, a chilling chorus that filled the night. The coyotes had chosen their prey. The alpha lowered his head, his ears flat, his body coiled like a spring. A signal passed through the pack without word. The hunt had begun. Bailey's eyes widened, reflecting both the moonlight and his terror. He yelped again, a tiny, desperate sound that seemed swallowed by the night. He tried to back away, but his paws slipped on the damp earth. The ring of coyotes tightened. Their lean bodies moved in perfect rhythm, a circle of hunger closing in on innocence. Bailey crouched lower, pressing himself into the grass as though he could vanish into it. The alpha coyote snarled, its sharp teeth glinting. The sound cut through the night like a blade, sending shivers down the puppy's spine. Bailey's small body shook uncontrollably. His heart pounded so hard it felt as though the entire valley could hear it. In the barn, the horses shifted nervously, their instincts sensing the predators outside. Chickens clucked restlessly in their roost. The air grew heavier, charged with primal fear. But still, the farmhouse lights glowed with the illusion of safety, unaware of the storm about to break. The circle was nearly complete. Bailey's escape routes vanished one by one. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. The coyotes were seconds away from striking. The alpha raised its head high and barked sharply. The sound was cold, commanding, and final. In response, the pack growled louder, their bodies tense with anticipation. The hunt had been sanctioned. Bailey whimpered and stumbled backward, his tiny legs nearly giving out. His wide eyes darted from one predator to another, seeking mercy where there was none. His small voice let out another cry, shrill and helpless, a plea to the night itself. The alpha advanced, his steps measured. Each movement pushed Bailey deeper into despair. The other coyotes mirrored his motion, their bodies weaving in a deadly rhythm. Their hunger outweighed hesitation. Their fangs gleamed under the moon. Inside the farmhouse, Mr. Sanders frowned. Something tugged at his instincts. He glanced toward the window, peering into the dimly lit yard. He saw only shadows swaying in the distance. Strange, he muttered, before turning back to his chair. Outside, the alpha's bark rang again, this time a command to kill. The pack tensed, ready to lunge. Bailey closed his eyes, his body trembling. For the tiny puppy, this seemed like the end. At the very edge of despair, Bailey released a sound unlike any he had ever made. It was not a bark nor a whimper, but a desperate, high-pitched howl that rose into the night. It cut through the valley like a blade, sharp with fear and sorrow. For an instant the coyotes faltered. Their ears twitched, their paws paused mid-step. The unexpected cry unsettled them. But hesitation did not last. Hunger drove them forward. The alpha lowered his head and snarled, lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. He lunged a step closer, forcing Bailey backward. The tiny puppy's body trembled, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. His eyes darted toward the farmhouse, but it was too far. No human could reach him in time. Inside the barn, the horses stomped nervously. Their nostrils flared, their ears pricked at the sound outside. Chickens rustled and clucked in panic, sensing the predators. Yet no one came. Bailey was alone. The coyotes closed in once more, their growls harmonizing into a chilling chorus. Bailey crouched low, pressing his belly to the earth as if begging the ground to swallow him. The alpha's eyes gleamed with certainty. The kill was seconds away. And then, from deep in the forest, came a sound that changed everything. A growl so deep and resonant it rolled like thunder. It silenced the valley. The coyotes froze. The night held its breath. The growl grew louder, vibrating through the ground itself. It was not the cry of a frightened pup, nor the bark of a simple dog. It was a warning, raw, ancient, and powerful. The kind of sound that only a creature forged by survival could make. The coyotes stiffened. Their tails lowered instinctively, their ears twitching nervously. Even the alpha hesitated, his authority suddenly challenged. He turned his head toward the forest, where the darkness seemed thicker than before. Something was coming. Bailey lifted his head, his wide eyes filled with both hope and confusion. His tiny body still shook, but the presence of that sound seemed to anchor him. Somewhere in the shadows, a protector stirred. From within the trees, movement began. Leaves trembled though there was no wind. A silhouette emerged, massive and deliberate. Step by step, the figure approached, and with each step, the coyotes retreated a little farther. Then the moonlight revealed him. Thick, shaggy fur. Amber eyes that glowed with a piercing intensity. Muscles rippling beneath his frame. He was no ordinary predator. He was the lone wolf, Shadow. Shadow's legend had long haunted the countryside. Farmers whispered of him. Travelers swore they had seen his massive silhouette crossing the ridges at night. Some called him a ghost, others a guardian. But none had ever stood this close to him before. The coyotes recognized the danger instantly. Their growls faltered, replaced by uneasy whines. The alpha stood rigid, his pride forcing him to hold his ground, though his body betrayed his fear. Shadow's presence was not simply threatening, it was commanding. He exuded authority that came not from size alone, but from experience, scars, and survival. Bailey watched, frozen in awe. The giant wolf's gaze flickered briefly toward him, and for a moment, the puppy felt the weight of those amber eyes. They were fierce, but not cruel. Bailey sensed something strange, safety. Shadow lowered his head, his teeth bared, and released another growl. This one was deeper, longer, vibrating through the air like a storm rolling across the valley. The coyotes whimpered, shifting uneasily, glancing toward their alpha for guidance. But even the alpha struggled. He snapped his jaws defiantly, but his tail twitched nervously. He knew they were no match. The choice lay before him: fight and perish or flee and live. The alpha coyote lunged suddenly, snapping at Shadow with reckless courage. It was a desperate attempt to assert dominance. But Shadow's response was immediate and terrifying. With a blur of speed, he swung a massive paw, claws slicing through the air. The alpha yelped, barely dodging, and stumbled backward in the grass. The rest of the pack panicked. Their formation broke. Some whimpered, others bolted toward the forest's edge. The balance of power had shifted in an instant. Shadow stood tall, his chest heaving, his amber eyes scanning the cowed predators. Bailey pressed himself lower into the grass, unsure of what would happen next. He trembled as Shadow advanced, expecting the massive wolf to turn on him. Yet the coyotes were Shadow's only concern. He moved with controlled fury, each step pushing them farther away from the trembling pup. The alpha tried to rally, barking harshly, but his voice cracked with weakness. The pack no longer listened. One by one, they turned and fled into the darkness, leaving only the scar of their presence on the grass. The alpha lingered a moment longer, his eyes burning with humiliation. But even he could not withstand Shadow's gaze. With a final growl, he too retreated, swallowed by the forest. Chapter 10. Guardian of the Pup. Silence returned to the countryside. The only sound was Bailey's rapid breathing, a fragile rhythm against the vast night. Shadow stood over him, his enormous frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the tiny pup whole. Bailey whimpered, his body shaking as he tried to crawl backward. But Shadow did not advance aggressively. Instead, the wolf lowered himself to the ground, his movements slow, deliberate, almost gentle. His amber eyes softened, glowing not with hunger but with an ancient wisdom. The puppy hesitated. His instincts screamed fear, yet something deeper urged him forward. With a trembling step, Bailey inched closer. Shadow remained still, his breathing steady, his presence calm. Then came a soft sound, a low rumble from Shadow's chest, not of menace but reassurance. It was as though he spoke a language older than words, telling the pup, "You are safe now." For the first time that night, Bailey's tail gave a timid wag. Against all odds, predator and prey sat together under the moonlight. In that moment, the lone wolf had chosen not to kill, but to protect. Dawn glossed the meadow with a pale gold that always made the world look newly made. Mr. Sanders, John to the neighbors who came for rhubarb and to borrow ladders, left his coffee half drunk and pulled on his boot. He told his wife he'd be careful, and took the older of their cameras, the one he wasn't afraid to scuff. Bailey whined to follow, but Mrs. Sanders gathered the pup and pressed her cheek to his head, promising him a warm blanket and breakfast when this was over. The forest accepted John in the way it accepted anyone who moved without hurry. He stepped over roots slick with moss and ducked under branches that had nested low over the years. Here and there, he saw the faint hieroglyphs of the night, pressed grass, a coyote's narrow track, the broader, deeper imprint of something heavier and alone. He found the clearing almost by accident, turning his shoulders sideways between two leaning trunks and stepping into a small bowl of light. The place felt used, not by people but by time. A scatter of old bones cleaned to ivory by seasons, a fringe of gray fur caught on bark, the slope of earth scooped and packed where bodies had lain. Something glinted. He knelt, cupping aside the leaf litter with the careful hands of a man who had once mended fence and at other times stitched a calf's torn ear with fishing line. The thing was half buried and reluctant, metal gone dull, leather gone stiff. He loosened it the way you loosen stories from old folks, gently, with patience and respect. A collar lay in his palm. The leather cracked when he bent it. The tag was grime-dimmed, the letters fainted by years. He rubbed it with his thumb until damp earth streaked his skin and the engraving sharpened to legibility. One word rose from the metal like a name spoken after long silence: Shadow. John sat back on his heels, the forest murmuring around him. The name fit the animal he had seen like a truth fits a mouth that is ready to say it. He looked at the scooped place in the earth, at the fur, at the bones that old hunger had left behind. A domestic thing in a wild place. A wild thing that had not forgotten domestic shape. He slipped the collar into his jacket pocket as if it might vanish if held too tightly, and the decision formed in him as naturally as breath. He would find out who Shadow had been. He brought the collar home like contraband, laying it on the kitchen table between the sugar bowl and the morning paper. Mrs. Sanders turned it over with careful fingers, reading the name aloud as if testing the weight of it. Shadow, she said, and Bailey, tucked in a blanket on a chair, lifted his head as though the sound had a taste he recognized. They made a small station of inquiry from ordinary things. The old laptop, a mugful of pens, a notepad with a feed store logo along the top. John typed with the steady patience of a man who did not pretend to know more about machines than he did. His wife read search results aloud, trimming the noise with the tidy scissor blades of her good sense. They started wide: lost dogs, wolf dog rumors, sightings along the Ridge Road, and then narrowed to the boards where people pinned hope in the form of photos and phone numbers. There it was, buried several years back like the collar had been buried in leaves, a missing poster without the breathless punctuation of newer pleas. The photo stopped them. A wolfish dog with amber eyes looked straight into the lens, ears back not with fear but with focus. The caption was simple: Shadow. Beloved family protector. Lost near the state forest during a camping trip. Please contact. Mrs. Sanders read the post out loud, her voice slowing on the last lines, where the writer had thanked strangers for searching and promised a reward the family could ill afford. The phone number was still there, still local, though the thread had gone quiet long ago. She wrote it on the notepad without comment. John stared at the digits until they stopped wriggling and settled into place like nails hammered true. What if they've moved, he said, but it was only a thought bumping against the shape of the moment. Or changed their number. His wife shrugged the gentle shrug of someone who had lived long enough to know that not all doors stay locked and not all maps stay wrong. Only one way to find out, she said, nudging the phone toward him. When he dialed, the ring sounded like something crossing a long distance even though the towers were close, like a rope thrown over a river. On the third ring a woman answered, the guarded hope in her hello as plain as a porch light turned on at dusk. John's words tumbled once, and then arranged themselves. He spoke the name on the tag. He spoke of the night and the pup and the way a wolf had stood where a gun once might have. The silence on the other end was not empty. It was full, of breath taken in, of a memory set down and lifted again. "Shadow," she said at last, and the syllables trembled. "I thought he was gone." They agreed not to rush the miracle. The woman, Laura, would come in the morning, when the light made gentler work of seeing what time had changed. Until then, John told her, he would walk back to the clearing and lay the collar where the wolf might find it. He promised not to force anything, promised to trust the same quiet sense that had told him to lower the shotgun the night before. He set out alone at first light, Bailey whining softly but staying behind under Mrs. Sanders' hand. The forest felt different now that he carried a name in his pocket. He noticed the small things he had missed yesterday, the places where big paws had compressed mud into coins, the way a bramble had been parted as if by a careful shoulder, the single gray hair snagged on a twig like a line on a page. When he reached the clearing, he stood at the edge and waited. The wind sifted through, bringing him the ordinary sense of earth and old leaves and fox. He laid the collar on the ground in a patch of light and stepped back 3 paces, then 3 more, until he stood where respect and curiosity could share the same breath. Minutes stretched into something longer. Birdsong resumed in short, questioning phrases. A squirrel scolded and then forgot him. Just as he thought to leave the collar and go, the far side of the clearing pressed inward, and shadow came. He was larger in daylight, not because light adds size but because it removes mystery. The scars were clearer now, and the burrs, and the dust that dulled his coat along the flank. His eyes, though, those were the same, burning not with hostility but with a steady, measuring intelligence. He saw the collar at once. His head tipped, and in that small tilt was a history. John didn't speak for a long breath. Words felt like the wrong coin to spend here. When he finally did, they were plain. "It's yours," he said. Or it was. Shadow moved forward with the care of an animal who had learned that not every gift is a gift. He sniffed once, twice. His chest rose and fell, a low sound rolling from somewhere deep, not a growl, not quite. A remembering. The wolf looked up. For a heartbeat the clearing held the old triangle: man, collar, animal. John felt foolish and human, and exactly in the right place all at once. "Someone is coming," he said, voice steadying around the truth. "She says your name like a door she's been waiting to open. If you want, I can bring her here. If you don't, I won't." The wolf blinked slowly, an old expression on a face not meant for human eyes. Then he stepped back. Not away, not toward, simply back, into a distance that belonged to him. John understood. Consent isn't always a nod. Sometimes it is the absence of refusal. He left the collar where sunlight warmed it and walked home by a different path, so that the morning could braid itself without his footprints through the same places twice. On the porch, Bailey met him with a hopeful trill. "He came," John said, and Mrs. Sanders smiled the tired smile of someone who had not slept but did not regret the debt. "Then let's make coffee," she replied, "and wait for the woman who lost a wolf and maybe found him again." Morning light spilled across the kitchen table where the collar rested. Its leather looked older in daylight, cracked and weary, but the name etched into the tag seemed more alive than ever. Bailey pawed at it curiously, sniffing, as though the scent of the wolf lingered there. The pup's innocent eyes reflected confusion, yet also recognition, as if a hidden thread already tied him to this mysterious guardian. John and his wife spoke in low voices, preparing for Laura's arrival. "If it truly is hers," Mrs. Sanders murmured, "what then? Do we simply hand him back, wild as he is?" John shook his head slowly, rubbing his tired eyes. "He's not the same animal she lost. Time and the forest changed him. But she deserves to know he's alive." When the sound of a car engine approached along the gravel road, Bailey barked excitedly. Laura stepped out of the vehicle, her face pale with years of hope and grief carried together. In her hand was a photograph, Shadow in his youth, bright-eyed, his coat glistening. She clutched it to her chest like it was a heartbeat she couldn't bear to lose again. Her eyes filled with tears the moment she saw the collar on the table. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought he died out there alone." Mrs. Sanders offered her tea, but Laura only shook her head, too restless to sit. Her gaze kept drifting toward the tree line, as though the forest itself might open and give her shadow back. John explained carefully what had happened: the coyotes, the confrontation, the protection of Bailey. Laura's lips trembled into a broken smile. That's who he was. Always protecting, even when it wasn't his fight. She pressed the photo onto the table beside the collar. 2 fragments of a story, waiting to be completed. That evening, they walked together toward the meadow, Laura clutching the photograph in one hand while her other hand clenched nervously at her jacket. Bailey trotted beside her, occasionally glancing up with curious barks as though sensing something monumental was about to happen. The air hung heavy with anticipation, each step echoing louder in their hearts. They reached the barnyard where the previous night's terror had unfolded. Laura scanned the tree line, her breath uneven. "Shadow," she called softly, as if the name itself might summon him from the shadows. Silence pressed in around them, broken only by the rustling of leaves. Minutes dragged into an eternity. Bailey whimpered, his ears twitching. Then, from the forest's edge, a shape emerged. Massive shoulders. Shaggy fur catching the last light of dusk. Amber eyes that glowed like embers still burning. Shadow stood still, watching. Laura dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she held out the photograph. "It's me," she whispered, tears streaking her face. "It's Laura. Your family." Her voice cracked, but she kept calling. Shadow tilted his head, his ears twitching at the familiar tone. He took one cautious step forward, then another. And then it broke. Years of distance crumbled in an instant. Shadow bounded toward her, his tail wagging, his body trembling not with aggression but with recognition. Laura cried out, laughter tangled with sobs, as she wrapped her arms around the wolf dog's thick neck. "You're alive," she sobbed into his fur. "You found your way back." The reunion was unlike anything John or his wife had ever seen. Laura clung to Shadow, burying her face in his coat as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. Shadow pressed into her embrace, licking her hands and whimpering softly, a sound not of dominance, but of memory and love rediscovered. Bailey barked excitedly, circling around them. The pup wagged his tiny tail furiously, bouncing against Shadow's massive frame as if welcoming him home. Shadow lowered his head to sniff Bailey, then gave the pup a gentle nudge with his nose, a sign of approval. John felt a lump in his throat as he watched. There was something unearthly about it, a wild creature bridging years of separation to embrace his past. The scars on Shadow's body told of battles and loneliness, but here, in Laura's arms, he was whole again. "I thought we lost him forever," Laura whispered, her hand gripping the collar that John had found. "But he never stopped being who he was. He never stopped protecting." Her tears fell freely, soaking into Shadow's fur. For a long while, no one spoke. The meadow held its breath, cradling this fragile moment of grace. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if honoring a bond that had survived time, distance, and the wild. Though Shadow had been reunited with Laura, his gaze kept drifting back to Bailey. The puppy yipped, running circles around him, tripping over his own paws but never straying too far. Shadow's amber eyes softened as he watched the tiny dog. There was something in his stance, something protective and unyielding, that suggested his loyalty had expanded. Laura noticed. She wiped her tears and smiled faintly. "He's watching over him," she said softly. "Just like he used to watch over my boy when he was little." Her voice cracked at the memory, but she kept her hand on Shadow's back, steadying both of them. That night, Shadow refused to leave the farmhouse yard. He sat tall near the barn, his ears pricked, his body still and alert. Coyotes howled distantly in the forest, but none dared approach. Bailey curled up at Shadow's paws, his small body pressed close to the warmth of the giant wolf dog. John watched them from the porch, his shotgun forgotten by the door. "It's not coincidence," he murmured. "He chose to stay with Bailey." Mrs. Sanders nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe he sees something in him. Something worth guarding." The night passed peacefully for the first time in weeks, and when dawn broke, Shadow was still there, standing watch, eyes fixed on the horizon as though daring the forest to send its threats again. By the third day, Shadow's presence had begun to change the rhythm of the farm. The animals were calmer, Bailey bolder, and the Sanders slept without the fear of coyotes at their doorstep. But balance was fragile, and the forest was not yet finished with its story. Late one evening, as the last rays of sunlight melted into the trees, a single coyote appeared. He was larger than most, with one ear torn in half and scars crisscrossing his muzzle. His golden eyes glowed with cunning and history. He did not lunge. He did not snarl. He simply stood at the tree line, watching. Shadow stiffened instantly, his fur bristling. He moved forward, placing himself between Bailey and the scarred intruder. Bailey yipped in alarm, but Shadow's growl rumbled low, a warning not to come closer. Yet something strange followed. The scarred coyote did not advance. Instead, he sat back on his haunches, his tail flicking once. His eyes never left Shadow's. There was no hunger in them, only recognition, perhaps even challenge. Laura clutched John's arm nervously. "What is happening?" she whispered. John shook his head, transfixed. "They're not enemies. They're talking." Shadow barked sharply, low and deliberate. The scarred coyote responded with a guttural sound, half snarl, half speech. Back and forth they went, a language older than words, until the scarred one finally turned and melted into the forest once more. Shadow remained still for a long moment, ears twitching. Then he returned to Bailey, nudging the pup reassuringly. Whatever had passed between him and the scarred coyote was not finished, it was only beginning. Shadow did not chase the scarred coyote that night. Instead, he paced the edge of the pasture in a slow, deliberate line, head low, shoulders rolling like a tide. Every few steps he paused to scent the wind, to read the invisible script that predator and prey leave behind. Bailey followed at a respectful distance, placing his small paws in the hollows Shadow's weight had pressed into the grass, as if learning a lesson written without words. John watched from the porch with the patience of someone who had spent years reading weather from clouds and harvest from light. He noticed how the rhythm of the farm shifted under Shadow's quiet governance. The horses no longer startled at distant howls. The barn cats moved with an easy arrogance again, as if the world had remembered its old order. Even the chickens slept without that restless clucking that comes when foxes linger too near a fence line. Near the gate, Shadow stopped and lifted his muzzle to the dark. The answering chorus from the forest was not a challenge this time. It was a reply, layered and uncertain, voices braiding and unbraiding in the night. The scarred coyote's tone threaded through, lower, steadier, like a reed note beneath a song. Bailey's ears tipped forward. He made a small sound in his throat, a pup's imitation of a howl, and then looked up at Shadow for permission he didn't know how to ask. Laura stood beside Mrs. Sanders, arms folded tight against the chill. She could feel the tremor in her own chest easing, the way a long-held breath finally releases. "He isn't just guarding," she said softly. "He's negotiating." Mrs. Sanders nodded without taking her eyes off the pasture. "He's setting lines," she answered. "Not just for them, for us as well." When the reply from the trees faded, Shadow began again, tracing the farm's boundary with the relentless precision of a plowman walking furrow after furrow. He paused at each corner post, at each gap in the hedge, at the shallow creek where tracks smudged the bank. He left the kind of messages only the wild can read, and the wild read them. By midnight, a strange peace settled. Not silence, never silence, but a workable truce. The forest breathed at its edge, the pasture breathed at its own. Between them stood a single animal who belonged to both. Bailey curled at Shadow's forepaws, eyes slipping shut in trust that felt impossibly brave for something so small. Before dawn, Shadow rose and looked once toward the timbered ridge. The scarred coyote answered from somewhere out of sight, a brief, sober sound. It carried no threat. It sounded like agreement. The next afternoon, Shadow led them away from the house, not by command, but by the kind of invitation you sense in your bones. He started at the fence gap nearest the cottonwoods and slipped into the understory, never looking back to see if the humans followed. He already knew they would. John alerted Laura with a nod and took the narrow deer path he'd walked as a boy, one hand brushing branches aside for her as they went. The forest cooled with each step, the air changing from hay-sweet to loam-rich. Shadow's shoulders rocked ahead, quiet as a rumor. He stopped at a shallow bowl of earth between two boulders where the light fell thin through a slit in the canopy. The den had been empty for a long time, but empty in the way an old house is, full of the lives it once held. Bailey hung back at the threshold, toes digging, head cocked. John crouched where the earth met stone and brushed away leaves damp with last night's dew. Something stubborn resisted his fingers. He worked it free, careful as if he were unwrapping a fragile keepsake. Leather again, older than the first, the grain split and curled. The tag's face was clouded. He rubbed it across his jeans, then with the pad of his thumb until the metal caught the weak light. The name rose slow, letter by letter, as if returning from a depth. Dakota. Laura's breath hitched. She said the name aloud, and it filled the clearing like a bell tone. "I've read that word," she murmured, kneeling beside John. "In old threads, in stories told by hikers, in notes that never led anywhere. No photo. Only a name." She turned the collar in her hands as if turning a thought that had waited too long for proof. Shadow stood a little apart, head lowered, not in shame, not in grief, but in a recognition that pulled at both. He stepped forward, touched the collar with his nose, and made that low memory sound again, the one that had passed through him when he first saw his own. Bailey inched closer, sniffed, and looked up at Shadow with a question in his eyes. John felt the shape of a larger story settling into place, the way fence rails slot into posts when you line them up true. Whoever Dakota was, he said, half to himself, he mattered enough to be buried in the quiet of this place. And Shadow wanted us to find him. They did not take the collar right away. They sat with it a while, letting the forest speak around them, the tap of a woodpecker down the ridge, the light scuff of a deer in last year's leaves. It felt wrong to hurry a name reclaimed from dirt and seasons. Only when Shadow turned and started back toward the farm did John lift the collar gently, wrapping it in his bandana as if dressing a wound. Word travels in the country the way water finds low ground. By evening, a truck rolled up slow on the gravel, and an old man stepped out in a jacket rubbed shiny at the elbows and a hat that had seen 3 decades of weather. He introduced himself as Earl, though nobody asked. In places like this, some names arrive with their own permission. He stood at the edge of the porch, hat in his hands, and looked from Shadow, posed like a statue at the yard's rim, to the collars on the kitchen table. His eyes held the kind of careful interest that comes from having said, "I don't know" more times than you've said, I'm sure. "Heard you found something that belongs to the stories," he said, voice low as a creek in August. Over coffee that had been reheated twice and still tasted right, Earl laid out the bones of a legend the way you lay out tools before a job. Years back, he said, there'd been talk of a dog that wasn't quite a dog, who moved between the fence lines and the tree line with the grace of someone invited to both suppers. Dakota, they called him. He wasn't just tolerated by the Coyotes, he was necessary to them. A go-between. A suture pulled through the tear between wild and near wild. He told of lambing seasons that went smoother when Dakota was around, of coyotes who veered wide of the henhouse when they should have slipped through, of a night when a hiker fell and lay out cold until morning and woke with coyote tracks circling him like a prayer the dark had said on his behalf. Then one winter, Earl went on, hands cupped around the mug like it held fire, Dakota was gone. Nobody knew where. After that, Coyotes got jumpier, bolder in the wrong ways. Something steady had been cut loose. Laura kept her palm on Shadow's shoulder as if to root him there with them, while Earl's words braided past and present. "You're telling me he carried a role," she said, "not just a name." Earl nodded once. "A role's heavier than a name," he answered. "A name tells you who you are. A role tells you where to stand when the storm hits." John laid the two collars side by side. The room seemed to contract around them, as if the house itself leaned in to listen. "If Dakota was the bridge," he said, "maybe Shadow is the span laid down after the last one washed out." Earl's look was steady and kind, the look of a man who knows that sometimes what you say out loud makes it possible to walk toward it. "Reckon the Coyotes know it," he said. "Reckon the forest does too." The next days unfolded like careful stitches, each one reinforcing the last. Shadow drew a map across the edges of the farm that no human could see but everyone felt. Coyotes kept to their side, ghosts at dawn and dusk, their presence more echo than intrusion. On 2 mornings, the scarred coyote appeared alone at the hedgerow, sat and simply watched Shadow watch him. Neither moved forward. Neither turned away. Bailey learned a new kind of courage in the lee of this quiet. He ventured further than the porch now, nose busy, tail up, but never crossed the invisible line. When a hawk's shadow skimmed the pasture, he ducked and then looked to Shadow, who did not startle. The lesson held. The little dog began to mimic the mediator, not the frightened stray he had been. At the table, Laura and John traced old maps with new understanding. They marked encounters, times, places where tracks converged or veered, places where the forest pressed tight and where it opened its fist. Mrs. Sanders kept the kettle singing and the notes neat. They were not romantic about it. They did not call it magic. They called it work that required them to be precise and humble. At twilight on the 4th day, the truce rippled. A sound rolled in from the high timber, deeper than a coyote's call, colder, carrying weight like a rock tumbled down a dry arroyo. The scarred coyote answered with a short, clipped bark that did not belong to challenge or greeting. Shadow's head lifted, every line of his body sharpening until he looked not like a dog, not like a wolf, but like a blade hammered to purpose. Earl returned without being asked, as if the same current had pulled him to their door. He listened to the distance, jaw set. "Wolves," he said simply. Not question, not theory. Statement. "Haven't been a pack this low since the big freezes. If they're pushing in now, it's because the ridges won't hold them, or because they smelled a vacancy where there shouldn't be one." The air itself seemed to tense like a wire drawn taut between posts. Shadow moved to the pasture's edge and stood there, not pacing now, not marking. Waiting. Bailey flattened under the porch, eyes bright with an old fear he thought he'd left behind. Laura knelt and touched his nose. "Stay," she said softly, the first command she had given him, and for the first time in his short life, he obeyed. John checked the barn doors and the latch on the chicken run with hands that knew exactly what to do when weather shifted mean. He did not reach for the shotgun. Not yet. Out in the dark where two worlds met, Shadow stared north, and the north stared back. The alpha wolf towered over Shadow, his black fur bristling like storm clouds, his scars gleaming like old medals of war. He lunged again, jaws snapping inches from Shadow's throat. Shadow dodged, but the wolf's massive paw raked across his shoulder, leaving a streak of blood. The coyotes howled in support, their cries filling the valley. They darted at the other wolves, biting, snapping, keeping them at bay. The scarred coyote in particular fought with ferocity, his torn ear flapping as he threw himself against enemies twice his size. His loyalty to Shadow was unwavering, a testament to a bond forged in silence. Shadow staggered under the alpha's weight, his paws sliding in the dirt. For a terrifying moment, it looked as if the larger wolf would crush him. Laura cried out, stepping forward, but John pulled her back. "Trust him," John said hoarsely. "He's not fighting alone. With a surge of strength born from years of survival, Shadow twisted, slamming his shoulder into the Alpha's chest. The giant wolf stumbled, thrown off balance. Shadow lunged upward, jaws clamping onto the Alpha's scruff, shaking with fury. The forest shook with the sound of his growl. But the Alpha was not beaten. He roared, throwing Shadow off, landing heavily on the grass. Both predators stood panting, circling each other, eyes locked. The challenge was far from over. The wolves surged again, trying to overwhelm the coyotes. But something extraordinary happened. Instead of scattering, the coyotes formed a barrier, shoulder to shoulder, standing between Shadow and the pack. Their unity was startling, as if every scar, every howl, every life lost to the wild had brought them to this moment. The scarred coyote barked sharply, his voice commanding, rallying the pack like a general on the battlefield. One by one, the coyotes answered, their howls weaving into a chorus of defiance. It wasn't just noise, it was a declaration. They would not yield. Shadow staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his shoulder. He looked at the coyotes, at their scarred leader, and something passed between them: trust, respect, understanding. He threw back his head and howled, his voice deep and resonant. The coyotes answered, their combined cries shaking the night. Together they pressed forward. The wolves, larger and stronger, faltered against the sheer ferocity of united resistance. Teeth clashed, claws struck, and the meadow became a storm of chaos. Yet for the first time, the balance tilted, not toward domination, but toward defense. Laura clutched John's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "They're fighting for more than survival," she whispered. "They're fighting for each other." The wolves retreated at last, their snarls fading as they melted back into the forest. The coyotes stood panting, their bodies bruised but unbroken. Shadow limped forward, his breath ragged, but his amber eyes still burned with defiance. The scarred coyote pressed against him briefly, a gesture of solidarity. Then Shadow turned, his gaze fixed on something deeper in the forest. Without hesitation, he began to walk, slow but determined. The coyotes followed, their formation protective. The humans exchanged glances, then hurried after them, Bailey trotting nervously at Laura's heels. They walked for what felt like hours, deeper into the forest than any of them had ever ventured. The trees grew older here, their trunks massive, their branches twisted like ancient arms. The air grew heavier, charged with something unseen. Finally, they reached a clearing dominated by a single colossal tree. Its roots sprawled across the ground like veins of the earth itself. At its base was a hollow, dark and deep. Shadow stopped there, lowering his head reverently. The coyotes circled, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. John's flashlight beam caught something inside the hollow, a bundle wrapped in weathered fabric, half buried beneath moss and leaf. He crouched, pulling it free with trembling hands. Inside lay relics of another life. A leather-bound journal, a small locket, and a wooden figurine carved in the shape of a wolf. The resemblance to Shadow was uncanny. John flipped open the journal carefully, the pages brittle with age. Faded handwriting filled every page, notes and sketches of the forest, the animals, the coyotes. The name, Eleanor Reed, was written on the first page. She had lived here decades ago, a naturalist who had dedicated her life to understanding the wilderness. Laura leaned closer, reading passages aloud. Eleanor wrote of the coyotes not as pests or predators, but as guardians. She described how they had saved her life once when she was injured, how she had come to see them as protectors of something sacred in the forest. Her words spoke of a bond between humans and the wild, a bond that had been forgotten over time. The locket held a faded photograph of Eleanor herself, holding a dog that looked strikingly like Shadow, or perhaps Dakota. The figurine seemed to confirm it. This wolf dog had been part of a legacy stretching back generations, a legacy of guardianship and unity. Shadow sat near the roots, his amber eyes glowing softly in the beam of the flashlight. It was as though he already knew what the humans were only just discovering, that his path was not random, but woven into a story older than any of them. Mrs. Sanders whispered, her voice filled with awe. He's not just protecting Bailey. He's protecting all of this. Laura nodded, her hand resting on Shadow's back. And now it's our turn to protect him, and the forest he guards.